Hello, if you're subscribed to this channel, you may have watched a video that we published a couple of months ago now as part of our Here's a Thing series entitled How Firaxis Saved XCOM from Complete Disaster. It tells the story of how a game that I really love, XCOM Enemy Unknown, went through a really grueling development process in which its lead developer, Jake Solomon, spent years wrestling with the game's core design. Yeah, I'd recommend giving that a watch if you haven't already. It's a brilliant story and tells you a lot about the creative process and why it's so important to fail quickly and efficiently. Anyway, as a follow-on from that video, I was joined last week at EGX by Solomon live on stage for a more extended look at this topic. He brought with him a bucket load of unseen video footage from various points during the game's development, including an early pitch video for the game, which has a much more significant focus on horror than we would see in the final product, before we move on to a chunk of gameplay from roughly 2.5 years prior to the game's release. Although this footage right here looks very similar to the game we know as XCOM Enemy Unknown, so many features were either tweaked or pulled entirely before this game hit shelves. And finally, we have a short look at the team's experimentation with a more cinematic type of combat. So yeah, please enjoy.
If you wouldn't mind, can you give a big round of applause for the creative director of XCOM Enemy Unknown, XCOM 2, and XCOM 2 War of the Chosen, Jake Solomon.
Hi, everybody. That is a great picture. Oh, God, I'm so glad we're starting with that.
Hey, you sent it to me.
I did.
This is not my fault.
People did, yeah.
Okay, so this is a good place to start, actually, because when exactly was it taken?
This must have been either late 2007 or early 2008. So XCOM Enemy Unknown we worked on for 5 years, which not a lot of people know. It took us that long to make the game because what we're going to talk about today, because it had a lot of challenges, let's say. But yeah, when we started, we all moved into this big room, the team did, because we were going to make a pitch video. So we couldn't make any gameplay. I was still working on a Civilization game, so the art team was free, and they moved into this big room to make a pitch video. And you can see it. If you look at the whiteboard behind me there, those are all the frames. That's like the boards for the pitch video we made.
Yeah, we're actually going to watch that in a second, but before we do that, I'm going to ask a question I think everyone is thinking right now, and the camera team are going to hate me for doing this. What's this about? Oh, what's that right there?
I work for a large publisher, and we have a legal department. Okay. And they requested that we blur the logo to that Croak product.
Right, okay. It looks like a Coca-Cola Zero to me. All right, so I think this should work. We're going to have a look at the pitch video that you're talking about. So who are you showing this pitch video to?
So the reason you make a pitch video, because especially with a game like this, I think that when we described XCOM and we said we're going to update it, I think a lot of people in this room know what XCOM is, but everybody knew us as the Civ studio, and so when we said XCOM, everybody just pictured Civ, but with aliens. And so to get everybody, people on the team, especially people at our publisher, to sort of understand what we were trying to do, we had to make this pitch video because we would never make the game in time. And actually, it's important when people watch this pitch video sustained us. Even the team members, it sustained us sort of mentally for years and years and years, because we could look at this and say, man, if we could just get close to that, it's going to be okay. And I think there were many times when the game was just awful where probably our publisher would rewatch the video and be like, oh, God, I hope they get close to this thing. So, yeah, it's worthwhile to see.
All right, let's give it a watch. I think there are a few seconds of black here. And there we go. Yeah, from the makers of Civilization.
Oh, I made this tagline up, yeah.
Civilization again.
Okay, go ahead. Time units, you notice?
Oh, good.
We definitely got a situation.
There's almost like a survival horror style to this.
The vibe was very kind of horror-y, And you remember the original XCOM, that's what it felt like. These farm, these.
We've got movement, second floor.
So this is the only model from this that stayed in the final game. So you guys will recognize this model when you see it right here.
And the noise. I like that. That's about.
What are you doing? Stand down, soldier! Stand down!
Ramirez, report. What's going on up there?
This is very dark. Looking back on it, this is very dark.
Line him up! Line him up!
40% chance to hit.
Target acquired. We got him!
Shit! I'm behind! Fall back!
Yeah. What was that at the end?
That was the original Sectopod.
Man.
That was our original vision for a Sectopod, which is kind of, looks kind of like a giant robot Big Daddy. But, yeah, like that was like a 2-story Sectopod. And again, we spent so much time making all those assets, and of course, none of it made it to the final game, because that was a good 4.5 years before we shipped.
Sure. And what was the reaction to the pitch when you showed it?
Everybody's very excited. I mean, I think that it actually kind of, in some ways it was good, in some ways it was bad, because it set us up. So when people saw that, then the good thing was that if they weren't paying attention to the game for the next 4 years, then they would stay very happy and excited, because they're like, yeah, it's going to be like that video. That thing was
the one with
awesome.
the big robot. It'll be great.
Right. And so even team members, they'd be like, I'm sure we're going to get back to that at some point. But it also kind of set the bar pretty high. And so for us, like, we didn't look anything close to that. A lot of things changed. And so it also kind of like set us up for like being really stressed out really early on. But overall, it was a very good thing to have.
Sure. I mean, this is something we covered in the piece that went live last month, which was that this wasn't your first go at making XCOM at Firaxis. It was actually your second attempt.
Right. So I was at Firaxis Games. I'd been there for 7 years already when this game started. And even before that, in 2004 or 5, I had already tried to make remake XCOM, because we had the rights to it, and it was always the game that it's always been my favorite game. And I think everybody, even in this room, everybody has a game that I think you've either played a long time ago, you invested a lot of time in, and time has passed, and you just think, if I remade that game, I would do it like this, and it would be so much better. It's a great game, but I could make it so much better. And for me, XCOM was always that game, which, again, is a very foolish way to think. But, so, yeah, I tried to do it before, and it was a horrible... I'm trying not to curse. I don't know if I can curse.
I believe you called it a piece of shit last time.
Okay, good. I can curse. Yeah, it was a piece of shit, actually. I put everything into it, and it was an awful piece of shit. And so then a couple of years later, we got a chance to do this with an even bigger team. I don't know. That sounds like, I don't know how that works out. Like, I made this thing, and it was a piece of shit. And then 2 years later, they gave me even more money to make it. So, and that set us on our course for the next 4 or 5 years.
Okay, so the next video that we're going to jump across to, and we're going to be talking over the top of this one, I think it's like 13, 14 minutes of gameplay,
Right.
Is actually a vertical slice, so a representation of the game from a certain point in development. At what point in the game is this footage?
Yeah, and the video we're actually going to see is the second vertical slice. So this one, we already had a vertical slice in April of 2009, which was, again, another very unsuccessful prototype. And so then this is our next vertical slice in 2010, which, again, this was a good 2.5 years before the game actually came out. So you can kind of see what XCOM became here, but we were still very, very far off from what the game actually ended up being.
Yeah, so this is actually something that, by the way, I love that you kept the clipping.
Oh, yeah, right through the door, right through the door.
Like a lot of people that are looking at this right now will think that looks remarkably close to the game that we eventually played.
Yeah.
And this is still 2.5 years before you completed it. Is that
yeah.
right?
Yeah, I mean, the art team, I would say, did a great job making this game. The design team, i.e. me, did a terrible job. So there are so many things going on here, and you can kind of see some of the things that became what XCOM was. But you know, there's a lot of things here. Yeah, 2.5 years out, so many things changed. There wasn't really a strategy layer, you know, associated with this, and so yeah, we had some combat, but even this. I mean, I think this map stayed somewhat, but this still has angled cover, right?
Yes, that's right. Which is why you also have these lines going from the cursor to each of the enemy units. So, do you want to talk about those a little bit?
I can laugh about this now, obviously, but this was really, this was in the very dark period for us. We had to deliver another vertical slice. We had to prove that we were on track to ourselves, to the publisher. But things weren't going well, so yeah, the next time somebody moves, you'll see, like, every time you pathed in this prototype, lines would be drawn from there you go, from every pathing cursor to every surviving alien. And here it's not that bad, there's one, but if you have like 3 or 4 on screen, it would draw lines, and then it would draw certain colors of lines, and then it would draw dashed lines, and it was just it was a nightmare. And I cannot believe that, like, my art director, Greg, who's still with me, if you can believe it. Yeah, like, I cannot imagine how horrible he must have felt, like, because it was a good-looking game, but yeah, I was shitting all over it with my design ideas.
I think one of the issues that you've talked about before is that with this approach, it means that instead of looking at the bridge that your soldiers are on, or even really looking at the soldiers themselves, you're looking just at the lines, because each tile you really just want to make sure, can I get a flank, am I going to hit, and you stop actually paying attention to what the game is.
Yeah, there's so much UI that the game is just a UI game. You know, you would see a flank if the line turned orange, you were flanking, and so you're just moving the cursor around, and it was just a really, it was not good. It was not good, and so yeah, so this was still quite a ways out.
So the reasoning for that design choice, I think, is interesting, because you mentioned angled cover. You can see that car actually, over on the right side.
Little yellow car, yeah.
So the issue with angled cover was that it wasn't clear to the player when exactly they were going to be able to get a flanking shot. If an enemy was in angled cover.
Right, it's a huge part of XCOM, is being able to get around the cover of your enemy and flank them, as we call it. But when it's angled, you have to eyeball, especially when the enemy is far away. You really have to eyeball things. You have no idea what's a flanking shot. And so because of that, and we had weapon ranges and all these things we no longer had in XCOM. So we had different weapons at different ranges. So we had to represent all this stuff, and the only way to do it, at least that I found, was with these tons of lines all over the screen. And it just made for this really, it was really complicated and hard to understand, and it was just, and so yeah, you're just playing by UI at that point.
I also sort of want to touch on how it was that you realized that this was an issue that could be solved. This part of the design process at Firaxis, for Enemy Unknown specifically, was that you had a weekly meeting called Mutator Mondays.
Right, so we would be, there was so much we still didn't know about the game. That you put a game like this together, and you have no idea. You're starting from scratch. How many hit points should things have? Whoa, how big should weapon damage be? Should there be randomized damage? Should there not be randomized damage? All these things, and the only way we could figure that stuff out was to change it every week, play the game, and then compare it to last week, and then talk about what was good about that, what was bad about it, and if it was bad, did it teach us anything? And so we would do these mutators every week. We would just change the game fundamentally. Should there be fog of war? Should there be? And so, yeah, you're right. One of the things is everybody hated the lines except for me, and which shows how much I know. And so one of the mutators, somebody was like, can we please turn the lines off? And when we did that, I said, well, if you did that, we'd have to get rid of weapon ranges, and all cover would have to be 90 degrees. And so we said, all right, we'll try it. And then, we tried it, and that's how it changed.
Yeah, that's really cool. Do you think is it easier, like the process you're talking about there, about having to create this rule set from scratch? Is it easier to design sequels?
Yeah, Speaking as a guy who just designed a sequel, and then designed an expansion to a sequel, unquestionably, because it's funny because in your mind you have this idea of like, I'm going to make this game, but you don't realize, I didn't realize all the details. So if you say like, okay, enemies have a certain amount of hit points, like you have to establish some baseline, and that has a huge knock-on effect to how does your damage system work? How many missions are you going to have? So that means how many techs are you going to have, or upgrades, or loot? All this stuff feeds into these basic, how long do you want the game to be? How long are missions? You know, what's a reasonable amount of game time? And so you have to, oh, God, look at that.
Oh, God, yeah, okay.
That's the strategy layer.
Yeah, so this is another side of the game that you spent some time trying to figure out exactly how you wanted it to work.
Yeah.
And is this one, is your design based sort of loosely on the idea behind Pandemic, like the board game, right?
The board game. If anybody's played Pandemic, the board game, I was playing a lot of that. And since I couldn't come up with ideas of my own, I was like, I'll turn that into a strategy game. So, yeah, that looks nothing like, I mean, that has nothing to do with the game that we released. You do notice the random names are still there for the missions, though.
Yeah.
That was like one of the first things I put in. So, yeah, that strategy layer is completely different.
Yeah, you told me a great story about when you were working on the strategy layer, the fact that you were struggling with it, you didn't exactly know what you wanted it to look like, so you went to Sid Meier's office and sort of sat in there with him for a little bit and tried to figure it all out.
So, you know, Sid, of course, being, in my opinion, one of the, well, in everybody's opinion, one of the great strategy game designers of all time. I mean, I'd worked for him for years. He had been my mentor, so I'd never worked on a game without him until this game. And so I learned from him. And so this, by the way, that was a creative director at 2K, so I think we put him in there. I don't know if we were complimenting or not. And actually we zoom in on, this actually is our studio head, Steve Martin. Yeah, he's a former Army guy, so that actually is Steve
I'm not
Martin.
sure how much that says about your opinion of Steve Martin if you put him in your XCOM squad.
Well, that's true.
There's a whole thing about, like, you know...
I think he's the one guy that survives the mission, actually.
Okay.
Yeah, so when design wasn't going well, and this was true for anything, any part of XCOM, I would go visit with Sid, and I would say, because, you know, he's done this so many times, and I would say, this is the problem, this is what I'm trying to solve. And Sid would always help me through it, walk me through it, and so, yeah, he was like a huge part of design on XCOM. And so the strategy layer, we made like a board game together. He actually made a digital prototype himself. So, yeah, he was a big part of it.
This is an incredibly unprofessional thing to say, but I just like the idea that you can just go to Sid Meier with your problems. I've interviewed him once before, and he seems like a tremendously nice man. But I'd quite like that option in my working life.
He is. It is nice to be able to have. I mean, I couldn't have done it without being able to do that. But he's like me. He's actually very, you know, he's fairly introverted. He's kind of quiet, and so, like, you know, he'll sit in his office. He won't, like, come to your office and volunteer it, but I didn't care. I would just barge into his office and beg him, because I knew if I didn't get help, like, this was going to be a disaster, basically. Now, the other people, we didn't talk about this. The one thing I love telling people is that when we made our first prototype, right? So we actually got help from another group of people. When we were making our very first prototype of this game, we had this small team from North Carolina come up to help us learn the Unreal Engine. And they were like 7 people. And they stayed at our studio for like a month or a month and a half, and they helped us make our very first prototype. And then on the last day they were there, they were awesome guys. And the last day they were there, they let me play their game that they're working on. And it was called, like, Robot...
Supersonic, Acrobatic, something Battle Cars.
Yeah, Battle Cars thing. So I played this game, and it was about cars, and you're, like, pushing a ball around. And I really, really liked these guys. I really liked them. But I remember distinctly thinking, like, this is never going to work. Like, this is such a bad idea. And those guys, of course, were Psyonix Games, who went on to make Rocket League, probably the most popular game in the last couple of years. So that just goes to show how good of a designer I am, I think, is that I really recognize greatness when I see it.
I think this is one of the things that I found most interesting about this story, because Enemy Unknown is one of my favorite games. I really love it. It brought, you know, it reintroduced so many people to the XCOM franchise.
Oh, by the way, there's a flamethrower soldier, which we never put in the game ever. But yeah, go ahead.
But you're very honest about the issues that you had as its designer. Like, you're very self-deprecating about it. I feel like if I made XCOM Enemy Unknown, I'd be like, yeah, nailed it, first time. It's easy.
That's the way I went into it. Oh, by the way, here's a version of is that not awful? Look at that. We were gonna have, like, straight up random, like, almost like a quick time of there you go. Blood on the screen.
So you had the option to fight or run there.
What's that?
You have the option to fight or run.
Yeah, you can
when-
either fight or run based on a percentage. Super great choice. And everyone, well, you know, I think it is. It's true. For me, what it comes from is that, and I learned it based on making this game, is that when you start making something creatively, there's a lot of ego attached to it, and you're very, you know, it feels bad when you don't do something well. You worry about what people think about you, and it's not like that doesn't happen for me, but I learned very quickly, like, if I'm not very, very honest, if I'm not, especially because I lead the team, if I am not 100% honest about the state of our products, then that doesn't help that hurts the product. Like, if I don't immediately come out and say, like, I just did something, I put an idea, if I'm not the first guy to recognize, like, that idea is terrible, like, all I'm doing is hurting our chances of being successful. And it is so difficult to make games. It's so high stakes. Your first bad game is going to be the last game you make, and I know that. And so for me, I cannot afford to worry about ego or anything like that. And so that's sort of like freed me now to be like, yeah, I've made a lot of really bad decisions, and eventually it's worked out. And so I feel free to say, like, look, I made a lot of bad decisions. I made a lot of mistakes, and I hope that I never stop recognizing when I've made mistakes, because I have to. That's part of my job.
Do you find it difficult to look back at this stuff now and see this footage, which represents, you know, some months or perhaps like, well, a couple of years really of like a you know, design decisions that weren't quite going your way?
Yeah, I mean, I actually, this is such a treat for me to watch this stuff. I mean, we have a lot of emotion invested in this stuff, and but yeah, I mean, it is crazy to think that it took us almost 5 years to make XCOM, and so much. I mean, that's the thing, is that you see this and you think like, oh, that's pretty close to Enemy Unknown, but it's not at all. I mean, we had so much more time to go. Like, this map never made the game. Like, this map never shipped. And so there was a lot of, there were 2.5 years of like really like many days of panic and being really concerned because the game that we had just wasn't that fun to play. And so it is this weird thing about making games, probably all creative things, where you're just in this state where things are not good, and if you don't do something about that, like, you know, you're going to lose everything. And that's where I still go through that. Still making games now. We had our moments on War of the Chosen where I'm like, wrap it up, close up shop, we're done. So yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing about making games. But now I can look back at this and feel very nostalgic. But at this point, I was probably drinking very, very heavily most nights, I think.
Do you think there's something in being able to, like, it's okay to make failures as a designer or as someone leading a project, but it's how quickly and efficiently you can recognize that there is a mistake and move on to the next thing?
Yeah. I mean, we always say internally we fail fast. Like, we don't want people to get hung up on the fact that we failed, because when I talk to my designers, I'll say, like, okay, we've got this great idea. Let's put it in, and, you know, we always say, like, it's going to be shit. This idea is going to be shit. We just don't know how it's shit. And so what we need to figure out, oh, by the way, here's this little cinematic sequence here to end the mission. Yeah, the important point is to figure out, like, what you've done. It's so dramatic. Yeah, the important thing is to find out what you've done wrong as quickly as you can, so you can move past that and then find out the next bad idea and the next bad idea and the next bad idea. And the hope is that you're slowly working your way towards something good.
I see. Cool. Well, yeah, that's the end of the big chunk of gameplay we've got. We have one more video to show, but before we play that, I will say that after that video, we're going to wrap up, and then we'll have time for some questions. So if you want to spend the next couple of minutes thinking of some nice ones, that would be good. And yeah, what's the final video of the free? What is it? So
it was made about the same time as this demo, and so we were trying to prove to ourselves how cinematic we could make you know, turn-based combat. And I don't know how many of these ideas actually made it, and I guess we'll see. But yeah, we made this entirely rendered video of two soldiers facing off against a couple of mutons. We were trying to prove, like, how cinematic turn-based combat could be. Cool. And was this just to see whether the idea worked, or was this another sort of pitch to? Yeah, it was basically, this accompanied our vertical slice video, and we sent it on to the publisher and we showed it to them, basically because I think there was such little, like, good gameplay behind what we had at that point. So we were like, also, we have this very pretty video, and that worked for us once before, so maybe this will work again. Okay, let's give it a watch.
Move out and keep your eyes open.
I got it.
It's really intense.
Stay down!
You're going to recognize this part.
Wow, I'm quite glad XCOM isn't like that because it's really, really intense.
Yeah, there are a lot of tricks there that actually cinematically, like the camera's angled, and that you know, they don't necessarily work out for gameplay, but it's an awesome movie.
Yeah, so there was stuff there like the fact that even between turns, like the units would constantly be shooting, almost like they were suppressing each other.
We tried probably everything, but actually we called that constant combat, and so the idea was that every time, and this is how the game worked for a while, basically whenever your units moved in range of enemies, they would both just start firing constantly, and it looked awesome. It got super annoying, like, you know, like it's basically just like gunfire all the time, but it looked pretty cool. So we had it in the game for a while, but yeah, again, one of the other things that just never shipped.
I kind of like that, though. It reminds me of the Mutator Mondays stuff, where the studio wasn't afraid to just try stuff and then drop it if it didn't work.
Yeah, I think we got to that point, maybe not from a good place. We got to that point because nothing was working, and so we were like, let's try everything. But it's good that happened to us, because I think that stayed in our DNA. And so now everybody on my team, we always know, like, when stuff goes in, we're not concerned with it being great, being perfect, being fun right out of the gate. We're concerned with, okay, what's wrong with this? And I'll be the first guy to get up there and say, like, this is what's bad about this. Let's move on to the next idea. And so I can't tell you how much that's sort of helped us as a team.
Sure, you can see it in War of the Chosen. You could very easily have called the sit reps mutators. It feels like it's like adding something just to see what happens.
That is exactly where they came from. They are basically mutators. The sit reps in War of the Chosen, we finally basically have made them into one of our retail products. Yeah.
And that'll do it. I hope you enjoyed this extended look at the development of XCOM Enemy Unknown. I promise not to make another video on that game for at least a couple of months. Yes, I should give a big thank you to Jake Solomon for being so candid with what must have been a very tough period during his career. And also, I'd like to thank Firaxis and 2K for being so generous with all this early footage. That doesn't always happen, I'll tell you. Yes, if you did like this video, do let us know, and we will see you next time. Goodbye.